Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life Sentences for Children, the neuroscientific basis for limitations on harsh sentencing. I'm Carmel Shachar, the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School's Executive Director. This event is going to be a really interesting exploration of how neuroscience has informed and could inform in the future legal decisions about children and young adults serving life sentences. Before we get into the substance of today's discussion, a few housekeeping remarks. First of all, this event is part of the project on law and applied neuroscience, which is a collaboration between the Petrie-Flom Center and our wonderful colleagues at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Massachusetts General Hospital. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the event, and we strongly invite you to submit questions. How do you submit questions? Well, you can do that at any time using the Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring that queue and pulling questions from there. You can also join the conversation or even submit questions on Twitter. We're at Petrie-Flom, and use the hashtag LawNeuro. Again, that's hashtag LawNeuro. If you have any technical issues, on the other hand, please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. That's the best way to get in touch with us to let us know things aren't working the way that they should. We are recording this event, and we anticipate sharing the fully captioned event video with all registrants within 1 to 2 weeks. If you registered for this event, which you probably did considering you're in this event, you should be getting an email letting you know that video went live. And please share the video widely with your colleagues, people who might be interested but couldn't make the event itself. Speaking of our events, if you like this event and like what you see, please sign up for our newsletter. It comes out only twice a month, so it doesn't clog your inbox, and it's by far and away the best way to check out our upcoming events, find out about center scholarship, and find out about opportunities. Please also consider reading our blog, Bill of Health. It is a wonderful venue for leading thinkers in health law and bioethics to write about some of the cutting edge issues in the field in a very accessible way. I also want to do a big plug for the amazing work and programming that the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior does. I really enjoy going to all of their events. Nobody's paying me to say that. I can absolutely vouch that the programming that they bring really explores the intersection of neuroscience and the law in a way that I think is thoughtful and unique. Their website is clbb.org. You can find them on Twitter at MGHCLBB, as well as on Facebook, again, MGHCLBB. With that, I want to introduce our moderator, who is going to guide us through the next hour. That person is Dr. Stephanie Tabashnik. She is a psychologist and an attorney. I can't think of any training and background that is better for preparing you to lead a discussion on the impact of neuroscience on juvenile sentencing. She is also a very interdisciplinary figure in that she is the senior fellow in law and applied neuroscience. So she is a member of both the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior and the Petrie-Flom Center. Dr. Tabashnik, I want to hand the event over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So first, what we're going to do is Leah Somerville is going to speak about adolescent and late adolescent neuroscience, and then I'm going to provide a brief presentation update on the legal landscape post-Jones v. Mississippi and discuss how states are navigating juvenile and late adolescent life without parole. Then we're going to have a rich discussion, so please put questions in the Q&A. And now I'm going to introduce Leah Somerville. So Leah Somerville is a professor at Harvard and runs a research laboratory focused on adolescent brain development. She's also an affiliated faculty member at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, and is interested in how scientific research and maturity translates outside of the lab to legal and other ethical contexts. So she is the perfect person to have speak today. And Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Can everyone see my slides without any obstruction? Excellent.
Yes.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and give a update of sorts on what is it that we have learned both over time and recently about brain and behavioral development during the adolescent years, and what the timeline of maturity looks like. So in that vein, I want to start at the very beginning, which is considering how it is that scientists study brain development in the first place. And I'm mostly going to focus on research on people today, although we should acknowledge that animal research on rodents and non-human primates has also taught us quite a bit. One type of research we see in the field is research that tracks an individual's development over time. So as a person grows up, we might test them multiple times, examine measures of their brain structure or function or their behavioral development. These are called longitudinal studies, and they're prized in the literature, but they take quite a long time and they're challenging to do. So another type of evidence we're also going to see is studies that compare some measures of brain or behavior across lots of different people who are each tested once at whatever age that they're at from childhood into adulthood. The primary measure we use for brain imaging and measuring brain maturation is MRI-based brain imaging. MRIs are safe and non-invasive and well tolerated even by small children. And they take many, many different kinds of images that tell us different complementary things about how the brain is changing with development. We can take images like these, and within a few minutes, this is a structural image of the brain that shows us the sort of gross organization and the structure that exists behind our skull. We can then analyze this for many different kinds of measures of the brain, including both size, shape, and organizational structure of different aspects of the brain, as well as connection pathways that link up distant brain areas into brain networks. One image we can derive is something like this, which you might imagine peeling back all of the surface of the brain, the gray matter, and looking underneath at all of the connection highways and pathways that link up distant brain structures, and they're sort of thread-like in this image here. We can measure their orientation, their organization, how large they are. We can also measure the size and volume of the overall brain or individual structures within the brain that we can isolate using different analyses. And these measures also complement other work that can look at brain function, how the brain is reacting to different perturbations we can give in the scanner, like asking participants to engage in self-control or making decisions. This is just a reminder for me to respect the contributions of animal research as well. And this has been instrumental especially for teaching us things about neurotransmitters and neurochemical development, which is hard to study in people.
Leah, I'm seeing this is great. I'm seeing it says build order or build effects on your screen.
Oh,
is there
well, that's not supposed to be there. One moment. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Let me stop sharing and start again.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I think I will be able to fix that. How about now? Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Let me hide one more thing. Okay. So let's examine what we've learned so far about the timeline of brain maturation. So something that at this point is very uncontroversial is the claim that the brain is continuing to develop throughout the adolescent years, and this is occurring on multiple levels. It's common knowledge almost that the brain continues to develop past the age of 18. I'd like to demonstrate that and then dig in a little deeper to what more we know than just that. These are example data demonstrating the active phase of brain development throughout the teenage years. This is isolating two major brain structure measures that isolate two different tissue types in the brain, gray matter and white matter. I already mentioned that white matter reflects the sort of connection pathways that link up distant brain networks, and that's what's being depicted on the left. Every dot is a person, and the fit lines are shown for males and females. They are subtly different, but in general, the patterns for males and females are extremely consistent with one another. What we see is a progressive pattern of development, meaning that white matter is growing throughout the adolescent years. This is thought to support a more efficient and more interconnected brain that can process more complex forms of information quickly and efficiently. On the right side, we can see the volume of gray matter in the brain, which we actually see having the opposite pattern. Gray matter reflects the computation centers of the brain, so neurons and local neural connections. And what we see is actually we're losing that tissue over time as we grow up. And this might sound alarming, except that the reason behind this is thought to be highly adaptive. Gray matter reductions are thought to be reflect pruning away of unused or unnecessary brain cells and brain connections to sculpt a more efficient system. And so we can think of it as sort of fine-tuning the efficiency of the brain. And you can see that that reduction is continuing well throughout the adolescent years. And if this graph went on, you would see it continuing past the age of 18 as well. One area of the brain that is particularly active in its development for a long stretch of time is the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in red behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex shows the same regressive pattern of gray matter reduction, but you can see the magnitude of that effect is quite large. We lose about 17% on average from mid-childhood until early adulthood. And this is a graph that represents data from many, many hundreds of participants. Now, the prefrontal cortex may be of particular interest today because it's crucial for a number of cognitive functions like planning, decision-making, and various forms of self-control broadly construed. It's also interesting because if we draw this line at the age of 18, we can see quite a bit of continued change beyond that age, which is, of course, the legal definition of adulthood in the United States. And so this is an example of a data point that reveals just how long and how stretched out some aspects of brain development are well into the 20s or maybe even beyond. So what have we learned? So these are sort of some of the main tenets that help us argue that brain development is ongoing well throughout the adolescent years and beyond. So what have we learned more recently? We've developed some tools that have helped us quantify with more precision when the brain is mostly mature. And I say mostly because we need to remember that brain development, the brain changes throughout our entire lifespan. There are developmental processes early in life. There are experience-dependent processes throughout life. There are aging-related processes. And so we should never think of a brain as sort of reaching like a set-in-stone kind of static point where it's no longer changing. That's just not the case. So we can't really look for a final point of development. So what can we look for? Well, we could look for a point where the changes that we observe with development are slowing down or tapering. And we've developed some tools to try to identify that, and we nickname this analysis type like a plateau point. These are example data, the details don't matter, but they reflect a developmental process where there's rapid change early in life, which you'll see on the left side of the graph. And then you see it kind of tapering off and more or less stabilizing, with each dot being a person. We've developed in the field tools that allow us to sort of identify these plateau points and the error around them, which is in gray. That can give us put some numbers on when different measures of brain development are largely tapering off or slowing down. And we've applied this kind of thinking to identify at what age things are slowing down across a number of different measures of brain development, which are shown here in different colors. I'm glossing over the details, and also across different parts of the brain, different lobes or the whole brain. And as you can see, there's a huge variability in the age at which we might find these putative plateaus that range anywhere from the early 20s all the way up into the 30s. And so if you ask a neuroscientist when the brain is finished developing, you might get a complicated answer that's sort of, well, somewhere between the early 20s and early 30s, depending on what you're looking at and where you're looking in the brain. So we're kind of having an increase of understanding of the nuance and complexity of answering a question, like when does the brain mature? Another big new direction in the research now is an increase in recognition and appreciation of the generalizability of our work. So generalizability is the scientific term used to think about who the research that's being done applies to. And it's a direct readout of who the research studied in the first place. So if I conducted a study on 50 teenagers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I might find some interesting things out about them, but I can't guarantee that those findings would apply to any other teens anywhere else in the world besides where I looked at them. And so there's an increase in recognition that more diverse and representative data sets are needed to characterize brain development with accuracy as reflecting youth in the United States broadly. This requires also large data collection efforts. There was research really showing the importance of this based on some new analysis tools that were applied to brain imaging data, where the researchers who did this work took a very large data set and noticed that there were certain subgroups of individuals that were sort of underrepresented in research. And this is characteristic of many, many studies. In particular, racial and ethnic minority participants and individuals with low socioeconomic conditions tend to be underrepresented in research. And this is true across many, many disciplines. But it becomes important for brain development research because they conducted an analysis asking, did that underrepresentation have an impact on the answer that they found about brain development trajectories? In other words, if they sort of reweighted the data that they had to amplify the influence of the underrepresented data points and reduce the influence of overrepresented data points to sort of balance that out, do they find the same answers or different answers about the timeline of brain development? And I'm glossing over a lot of the details here, but this graphic shows that the reweighted data in red and the normal use of data in blue. And the key point to take away here is that they don't perfectly overlap. They have differences. What those differences mean, how optimal they are, that's a whole different set of questions I'm not going to be able to address myself. But the fact is that representation matters. And that's what this graph shows because the lines diverge. So the field has made some very, very serious investments in more large and representative studies that really do have good generalizability to youth overall in the United States today. One such example study is an ongoing study called the ABCD study that some of you may have heard of. And it's ongoing right now at 21 sites in cities across the United States. And this is a coordinated sort of team-based science effort across many, many labs that's funded by the National Institutes of Health. This is the largest study of brain development ever been done in the US or possibly across the world. And it's enrolled almost 12,000 youth who are now in the process of being tracked for 10 years of their development, starting at age 9 or 10. Now, they're now mid-adolescents, and so this study is still very much underway, and much of what there is to be learned is just, something that we wait for more data at this moment. But I think it will transform the representativeness of understanding brain development as it reflects youth in the United States today, because their demographics and socio-demographic recruitment is very strictly mirroring the population of youth now. So this is an exciting development for us scientists. I also wanted to comment on some of what we know and what we recently learned about behavioral maturity. So of course, the brain orchestrates all of our behavior, but it's not nothing about any individual measure of the brain is a perfect readout of behavioral development, which emphasizes the need to study behavior itself. And the behavior is relevant to criminal decision-making, for example. And there's some tenets of behavioral maturity that we've known for quite a long time, one of which is that just the same way that brain development unfolds at multiple levels along multiple timelines, so too does behavioral development. This includes, if we contrast the maturity of our cognitive processes, which I'll define in a second, and compare that against psychosocial maturity, which has to do with social, emotional, and more challenging circumstances that may guide our behavior. And there's been quite a bit of research that supported the idea that these two major classes of cognition or behavior have different developmental timelines. This is one graphic that sort of contrasts these two sets of processes. If we look at the solid line, that reflects the timeline of cognitive maturity, which includes things like being able to hold on to multiple sources of information at once, to manipulate complex information, to have sufficient memory to hold on to many facts at a time, and certain kind of like planning and decision processes. You can see this is a complex trajectory where there's very strong gains in cognitive development from late childhood into mid to late adolescence, which is sort of the center of the graph. And notably, there continues to be fine-tuning in cognitive maturity past the ages of 16 and to 17 as well, up somewhere into the 20s. So there's a surge in development sort of into the early adolescent years that brings more and more sophisticated cognitive abilities. Now, this contrasts with the dotted line, which reflects a composite of psychosocial maturity. And I'll describe the pattern and then say a little more about what is encompassed within this concept. But we can see that psychosocial maturity remains sort of at a less mature state for longer through our development, and that only into sort of the young adult years do we see this sort of surge of maturity that is reflected in the uptick on this line. But the adolescent years reflect a period where there's a relative differential or mismatch of sorts between the relative maturity of these systems. Here's a very brief overview of the kinds of later developing behaviors and processes that would be encompassed within this concept of psychosocial maturity. It includes having a clear understanding of the risks of taking certain actions, being susceptible to excitement and thrills in guiding our behavior, acting without thinking or impulsivity, being susceptible to the influence by others, including peers, and also the ability and tendency to consider the future when making decisions about what to do in the moment. So that's just sort of a flavor for the kinds of factors that may encompass psychosocial maturity, which is very much continuing throughout the adolescent years. This is thought to have an important impact on behavior and decision-making. And this has been studied in the context of the lab by having participants make decisions about risk in the laboratory. These are usually like gambling style games where we can measure willingness to take risks in order to try to get rewards. This is a study that contrasted this kind of risky gambling setup in two different contexts or two different experiment setups, one of which encouraged participants to use deliberation and cognitive tools to make their risky choice, and another that really amped up that psychosocial element. So in the deliberate context, the one that is shown, that's described at the bottom on the right, this is a time where participants would see all of the odds and all of the information about taking a risky decision in the lab on a sort of gambling game, and then ask them to take their time, don't rush, consider all the information, and then give us their choice, and nothing exciting happens whatsoever. So this is meant to encourage deliberation, and we'll see how risky people tended to be in that condition. And we can contrast that against the exact same kinds of gambling decisions, but ones that are rolled out in a more exciting, thrilling, and heat of the moment kind of context. One in which participants were given immediate feedback. They were encouraged to sort of make their decisions in little chunks rather than thinking through the information and so on. Now, in this heat of the moment context, or something that people nickname a hot decision-making context, we see here that adolescents tend to engage in more risky choices than adults do because their data are higher up on this graph. And this reflects the idea that adolescents do have a taste for risk that outpaces adults. But that doesn't seem to be equally true in every situation, because if we look at the data about the deliberation, kind of more cold cognitive style of decision making, we see that this uptake disappears, suggesting that adolescents aren't uniformly having a taste for risk in every condition, but rather that they're susceptible to certain kinds of environments or contexts that might drive up that tendency to engage in greater risk taking. And this is an example that would sort of push on this idea of still developing psychosocial maturity. And it could lead adolescents to make very different decisions across very different situations, with adults behaving relatively, at least more consistently. So what have we learned recently? There's been an update, I guess, on our understanding of peer influence effects. There's a general idea, and this has been cited in a number of legal cases, that having peers present for making behaviors and choices increases adolescents' risky choice behavior. This has been reflected as well in laboratory-based studies. And in these laboratory-based studies, I'm glossing over lots of details, but what generally happens is people would be asked to come to the lab with a friend, and sometimes they would be making decisions all by themselves at a computer, as shown on the left. And sometimes they would be making decisions about risk on the computer with a friend looking over their shoulder. This is also sometimes done in driving simulators, which are a little bit more realistic for the real world. We conducted a study analyzing data from about 53 studies like this of over 5,000 participants to ask how reliably do peers influence risky choices, and what elements about the peer might matter. We found that simply having a peer there only increased risky decisions, honestly, a tiny, tiny bit. Maybe not much at all, but the characteristics about the peer had a huge impact on how much they would influence the decision maker taking risks. In particular, when adolescents are observed by a peer who themselves are pro-risk and have expressed this either by egging on the person who's making the decision or showing their risk preferences in another way, that has a tremendous effect on willingness to take risks. So people seem to be susceptible, especially to influence from pro-risk peers, and they're 2.5 times more likely to take risks while those peers are watching them. And this effect is similar in its size in both the younger adolescent age range, as well as in the later teenage years, extending through the late teens and possibly into the early 20s. So that adds a little nuance around how we understand adolescents to be influenced by their peers. In the final moments I have, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk not so much about what is in the mind of the developing person, but how external others may judge and make assumptions about developing persons. So in the law, there's an idea that culpability is mitigated by being young, right? That youth is associated with reduced culpability under some conditions and possibly reduced blameworthiness. But who do we grant that to? Like if you're an outside observer, to whom do you grant that reduction in culpability because of youth status? And it's hard to talk about this research, this is behavioral science research, without also talking about intersectionality, because it turns out the race and ethnicity of the individuals who are youth plays a major role in how they are judged by others in terms of their youthfulness and their blameworthiness for crimes. So this is research by Philip Goff and colleagues who had photographs of adolescents who are all the same age but varied along the lines of race. And they showed these photographs to people along with some details about a criminal act that they were accused of being involved in. They then asked the people in the study to guess how old that person is. How old is the person pictured? And they found that, first of all, people are not very good at this. They tend to overestimate how old adolescents are in general. But this is especially true for Black male youth. They're judged to be substantially older than they actually are. And this was most true when they were connected in these vignettes with more serious crimes. This is a graph showing for white, Black, and Latino youth pictured how old they're judged to be, according both to their race as well as whether they're suspected of less serious or more serious crime. And you can see that Black males are judged to be twice as old, twice as much older than they really are than white youth when their vignettes are attached to a felony description. This suggests that us granting this youth status, which may have some impact on decision-making in the law, seems to be granted much more readily to some racial and ethnic groups than others, with Black males being especially less granted that status. They're also judged to be more culpable for the crimes that are described. This is true for both samples of community adults who are doing this research as shown here, but also from police officers who volunteered for the same exact experiment. So just to close, I wanted to highlight a couple of things I've said in relation to how there are challenges inherent to translating that information to legal and ethical issues. For one, although we understand that brain and behavioral maturity is ongoing throughout adolescence and well beyond, there isn't a scientific consensus on exactly an age when the brain is deemed mature. It would be nice and convenient if we had such a thing, but we don't. This is partly because it changes always throughout our lives, but also what age it's mostly done changing depends on where you're looking, what measure you're looking at in the brain, and we don't have any consensus answer that crosses over all of those domains. We also, as scientists, tend to want to characterize individuals on average. So we may be looking for the sort of average timeline of brain development. This can make it challenging to extrapolate that information to say something about individuals. And in the law, it's all about the individual when we're thinking about individual cases. And so science has inherent challenges in being able to say anything about individuals based on these large group-based studies that we typically do. There's also an interesting translation between what we know about the brain and what we might infer or want to say about a person's behavior. The brain, of course, orchestrates our behavior, but it doesn't do so in a way that's one-to-one. Like we can't measure some index about the brain and then say, therefore, this person will behave this way. The brain exists and works in a much more complex way than that. So there's no single metric that can teach us something about a behavior based on the brain alone. This is why many scientists really privilege behavioral level research, but it's made less traction in the law. And so there's an inherent tension around what we should be learning from the brain versus characterizing a person at the behavior level. And finally, I think there's multiple layers of expertise that are required to really responsibly translate neuroscientific evidence into legal contexts. It's a fun and exciting challenge, one I'm very happy to be part of today, but I just wanted to acknowledge that multiple layers of expertise are really required to do this well. So with that, I will turn the tables back to Stephanie, and I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Leah. That was fantastic. So I'm going to be talking about the legal side of this. And as I'm going through this presentation, I want you to be thinking about what Leah just presented on and how much is relevant to the evolution of case law over the past year post-Jones. So there's two resources that I just want to flag at the outset. One is the white paper on the science of late adolescence. This was published earlier this year by the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. And then there was recently an article published by Francis Shen looking at the application of neuroscience to extend Eighth Amendment protections to defendants over the age of 18. I'm going to go into a brief history of how we got here, although I know many of you are very familiar with this, so I won't spend too much time on this. And I do want to say that I'm going to be covering the new cases at a quick clip, but these slides will be available online. So if you have any questions after, feel free to reach out, and you'll also have access to the slides. So as most of you are aware, we had three sort of main cases that were decided at the U.S. Supreme Court level that said essentially that children were different as a class. So we had Roper v. Simmons, Graham v. Florida, and Miller v. Alabama that barred execution for juveniles, then barred life without parole sentences for juveniles who were convicted of non-homicide offenses, And then we had Miller that eliminated mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles for homicide. You will hear the word mandatory is a limitation there. So Miller did not bar life without parole sentences, but it barred sort of automatic sentences of life without parole for first-degree homicide for kids. And what you'll see in all of these opinions are some quotes that reference the science, psychology, brain science, developmental psychology, neuroscience. So the courts were really turning to neuroscience and social science research when making these decisions and making the determination that kids were different from adults. So the Miller factors, which many of you are familiar with, looked at things like immaturity, impetuosity, whether children were able to appreciate risks and consequences. Judges were asked to consider the child's or the offender's family, their home environment, whether they were able to extricate themselves from their home environment, the circumstances leading up to the offense, how much of a participant they were in the offense, the effects of family and older peers or peers in general, their ability to engage with the criminal justice process, including their ability to really adequately navigate the plea bargaining stage of trial proceedings, and also the possibility of rehabilitation. So then we had a major pivot that occurred when the constellation of the U.S. Supreme Court changed, and this was Jones v. Mississippi in 2021. And this was sort of a dramatic departure from Miller, and indicated that judges didn't have to really thoroughly articulate the Miller factors. They just had to consider youth as a mitigating factor. So again, this was a departure. And what was interesting is that there was no discussion of neuroscience or social science research, despite the fact that since Miller, there had been dramatic evolutions in what we know about the brain and the developmenting brain, which Leah just went through. So, as the unlikelihood of federal protections for children regarding LWOP, sort of continues, now we're looking at the states, because that's sort of where the things are a little bit different. And states have really varied in how they've interpreted Jones. And I'm going to highlight some of those cases just because I think it's really important for understanding the legal landscape and where we are now. And since Jones, there's been over 240 cases that have cited Jones. Many of these cases involve juvenile homicide. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have, this is the DC sniper case, Melville v. State, Court of Appeals of Maryland. And they cited Jones and still said that a court is not free to sentence a child whose crimes reflect transient immaturity to life without parole, and that if an offender is deemed corrigible as opposed to incorrigible, the court cannot constitutionally sentence a child to life without the possibility of parole. So this is post-Jones. This was an opinion that was rendered 2 months ago. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Supreme Court of Georgia, this is Holmes v. State, that said that basically the sentencer does not need to say anything on the record about youth or the characteristics of youth before imposing an LWOP sentence, and that previously when the court held that there was an on-the-record explanation requirement going through the Miller factors, Jones had explained that they were mistaken and that no longer is necessary. This is also the case in People v. Boykin, a Supreme Court of Michigan case, which indicated there was, quote, no authority that imposes a higher standard of articulation regarding youth beyond just the court generally explaining a sentence. We have Commonwealth v. Felder with the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has more kids sentenced to LWOP than any other state in the country. And the court said that the previous burden that was placed on the Commonwealth to prove the impossibility of rehabilitation no longer was required over Jones, and that now the burden was no longer on the Commonwealth. So that was a pretty significant change. Kitchen v. Whitmer, this is an Eastern District of Michigan case, said that, quote, Jones dooms Kitchen's Miller claim. And that the judge did not need to consider mitigating factors of youth, and that the attorneys, not even the judges, the defendant's attorney's statement during sentencing that his client was a young 17-year-old man put the judge on notice that the defendant was under 18, and that was sufficient for satisfying the judge needing to consider youth. So Washington State has been a state that's been really interesting, and I want to thank Kristen Carson for some of the legal research on this. So we had Henry Munchke in 2021, which was a really interesting case, and we saw something that we hadn't seen in other states, where there was an expansion of Miller protections somewhat to those who are younger than 21. So mandatory life without parole sentences were deemed unconstitutional for offenders who were below the age of 21. And the court leaned heavily on neuroscience. In the majority concurrence and dissent, the term brain was used nearly 24 times. There were, references to neuroscience. They used neurological. They talked about social science. The court articulated that the general differences between kids under 18 and adults were also present for those who are older than 18. And they talked about the developing brain and held that the same protections that were present for those under 18 also applied to those who are 19 and 20. And the court continued on this trend in State v. Rogers, a May 2021 case, where the court said that it was within its discretion to issue a sentence that had a dramatic departure downward for a 16-year-old who was sentenced to 106 months for a first-degree murder. And the court said that this discretion was really important because the judge needs to be able to consider the mitigating qualities of youth at sentencing. Now, and then there was another case, State v. Miller, in March 2022, where the court held that a trial court judge, the sentencing judge, failed to consider the mitigating qualities of youth. And this was a quote from the sentencing judge involving the defendant. The judge at the sentencing said, "Most young people's lives aren't set in stone by the time they are 17 years old. Yours is." And the court said that this was not sufficient, Washington State, and that the sentencing court had failed to meaningfully consider youth, environment, and family circumstances, and that the defendant was entitled to resentencing. So we had a couple more cases that were kind of in line with this line of reasoning, and then we had a sort of dramatic departure later in the year, and also most recently in State v. Anderson. This was a case that the opinion came out in September, so last month, and the court seemed to really limit the protections that had been put forth in Miller and then also Munchke, and really narrowed Munchke. And in the dissent, there was actually, the dissenting, one of the dissenting judges said that Munchke had been sort of overruled without the court even sort of commenting on that. But what the court said in State v. Anderson was really there was a focus on looking at the behavior around the crime and less focus on the Miller factors. So, for example, the Supreme Court highlighted that the defendant had, this was a premeditated crime, and that was a real focus of this opinion, that premeditation, that the defendant had an opportunity to deliberate, to make a decision, that this was planned, there was nothing impetuous about it. There was no evidence that he didn't understand the consequences of his actions. They talked about how the defendant wrote letters after the murder that showed that he knew the consequences and lacked remorse. And they also said that Anderson was 17 and a half years old and living on his own during the crime. So this was sort of a mark of maturity, which I found sort of a false marker of maturity, just given that, a 17-year-old living on their own, that's not a great situation. And Anderson was actually in a home environment with a lot of drug trafficking and sex trafficking and a lot of other things that sort of led to him leaving home. And then the court said that a juvenile offender must show that their maturity, impetuosity, or failure to appreciate risks and consequences that are characteristics of youth contributed to the commission of their crime, and that the Washington State Constitution does not prohibit or preclude a de facto LWOP sentence if it's established that the juvenile offender's crime did not reflect the mitigating qualities of youth. So this was a very interesting opinion. And the dissent, there were two dissents, both I highly recommend that you take a look at. They were really interesting and I think really powerful. And the first dissent talked about how the sentencing judge abused their discretion because they failed to consider how juveniles are different from adults and the rehabilitation that Anderson had gone through over the past several years. And so the dissent was sort of talking about, hey, wait, what about the Miller factors that we're no longer considering? And a quote from the dissent is, the majority rewrites our jurisprudence to profoundly limit the protection we have found our state constitution gives to children without showing that those decisions should be overruled. And I think what Washington shows pretty strongly is that, you know, any gains we make are fragile. And in this case, there was a real limiting of some pretty profound expansion of some of the constitutional protections that we saw just a year prior. So in summary, states have interpreted Jones differently, and also states are often misapplying neuroscience and behavioral science research. And that, I think, is a pretty significant challenge and a problem. And I am glad that we have Leah Somerville here, because, you know, the law can say that neuroscience doesn't matter, and the law can say that it's irrelevant, but courts can't decline to give courts can't misrepresent or misapply the science. And so that is why we have Leah, and feel free to put questions in the chat. I know I have a lot of questions for Leah. So I'm just going to launch into these. So my first question for Leah is that some state courts are saying that brain science within the context of LWOP is not newly discovered evidence. And also some attorneys, on the other hand, are putting forth developmental science and research from 10 to 15 years ago. And I guess my question for you is, has science significantly changed in the past 15 years? And if so, how? How has our technology changed? How has the scope of our research changed? And do you see this change as significant?
Yeah, thank you. I have sort of like two sides of the coin answer to that question. On one side of the coin, the primary, very foundational research that showed us that brain development continues well beyond the age of 18 has not been overwritten by any brand new evidence. Like, that all still stands. What we learned originally is still true. It's not as though research has come back and said, oh, actually, we were wrong. Like, no, we weren't wrong. None of that was wrong. But I do think that we continue to learn more. And so the kind of ways that we can think about how brain development unfolds and its significance for behavior is continuing to fine tune. And so whereas previously we may have been looking at a very limited set of participants and a limited set of measures of brain maturation, I think we have a much fuller picture now of what brain development looks like. And it's only sort of refined and fine-tuned the big ideas that had been put forward previously, which are not wrong at all anymore. They just may not represent the full nuanced picture of what we understand to be true now. And so, like, what specifically, maybe you might wonder, have we learned that has refined our understanding? I think we've gotten more precise at charting out the later stages of brain development. And again, sort of going back to this idea that I put forward earlier about plateau points, or when brain development is sort of slowing and sort of tapering off, even though it never completely finishes. I think we have more precise answers about that across different measures of the brain. How helpful that kind of knowledge is for legal context, I would ask you that question. But I think that's one of that enhanced nuance is something that we understand better than ever before. And I think that the answers, the generalizability of the research, so in other words, the degree to which it's reflecting youth that across socio-demographic lines, that I think research is doing a better job of factoring that in to its inferences. So I think those are like the two big areas I would say we have made a lot of traction on in the last decade. None of that overwrites the previous work, though. It more adds to it.
That's helpful. So when, judges are often deciding how much weight to give scientific evidence. So would you say in the past 10 to 15 years, comparing where we were then and where we are now, that there's just there's been a lot more studies, there's been a lot more research, there's a lot more certainty about those conclusions? Is that something that you think would be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that would be very fair to say that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And I think we have a question from Dr. Judy Edersheim. So Judy, feel free to jump in.
Oh, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Those were both just wonderful presentations. I have a question for both of you, perhaps first to Dr. Somerville and then to you, Dr. Tabashnik. The court in Anderson did something very strange, a conundrum, and said that, well, we should look at the crime to see if it belies the mitigating qualities of youth. That seems to me to be a fundamental misunderstanding of the science and of the law. Can you comment on that construction a little bit?
Sure. I think regardless of the circumstances of a crime, we understand that adolescent decision-making is different than adult decision-making, that this can be applied across many, many conditions and situations and environments. That's sort of one tenet, I guess, of what the science has to say, is that the machinery we have to make complex decisions, including decisions around criminal behavior, is still developing in youth broadly. And that may cut across many, many types of situation. On top of that, though, I think we can layer on our appreciation that certain contexts, those involving heightened emotional circumstances, thrills, excitement, peers, and so on, are particularly challenging for adolescent decision-making on top of what might be a sort of baseline difference in the first place. So how to translate that exactly into the law is something I would ask you all to think about, but I think that the science would say that there is both a basic difference and a context-dependent either exacerbation or not.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think with Anderson, what was interesting is that there was this narrowing of the idea of, really just like the features of youth in general, but the court was really focusing on the impact of the commission of these factors impacted the commission of the crime, rather than how they reduce culpability more generally. And that was a really dramatic departure for the Washington State Court. I'm not exactly sure why that happened, and I don't think there's a sort of a scientific basis for that, but I think it's quite interesting. So along the lines of Dr. Edersheim's questions, I was wondering, often I'm asked by judges and attorneys about hot and cold cognition, and when sort of the hot cognition context ends. So if you have like in Washington State with the most recent Anderson case, they really focused a lot on this idea of premeditation. And I was wondering, if a planned crime occurs over the span of 2 hours, 8 hours, a day, 2 days, what can hot cognition context tell us about that decision making, if anything?
I don't think there's research that has looked at that over long timescales like you're describing. But if we think about decision making more generally, we can think of the in the moment factors that might shape the very momentary choices of how to act. But we can also think about beliefs and attitudes and goals that individuals have that might pre-exist and shape behavior in the moment, but be something that has already been planted, even long ago. I can give you one example in terms of susceptibility to peer influence. Spending a lot of time with peers that you believe are very pro-risk amplifies the amount of risk an adolescent is willing to take in their own decisions, and that peer doesn't need to tell them at that exact moment, like, I think you should take the risk. I think there could be a belief that, or a longstanding relationship that could impart that message over time. And it doesn't even necessarily need to arise in the very exact moments that the decision is being made. And so I think that knowing how humans make decisions, we know that there's both these momentary factors, and then there's a lot of priors and a lot of beliefs and information and goals that people bring to the table that can shape the way that those play out in the moment. And so I would imagine, this is a little bit extending beyond maybe what we know scientifically, but I would imagine that all of those factors could play in to shaping a momentary decision. And some of them do like precede the decision itself, but add background context and information that could shape a person's goals.
I think that's a really good point, and that's really helpful. So we have some questions from the audience. Someone wanted to have some clarification on when prefrontal cortex is sort of, I guess, fully developed, and if that occurs between the ages of 18 to 25 or a different range, and how does that intersect with executive ability?
Sure. I can't place an exact age on when the prefrontal cortex is done developing for the reasons I talked about in my talk, but I can say that the prefrontal cortex is one of the final waves of brain maturation. And so it's on the very exceedingly late side of things. There are other systems of the brain. We can take the sensory processing like vision and other senses and our motor activity, the brain systems that support those reach a developmental plateau much earlier by several years. If we're talking about the white matter that sort of feeds in and out of the prefrontal cortex, there's research showing that it doesn't show a plateau until somewhere in the 30s. And so putting a specific age marker on that is very challenging. The other question is, how does the prefrontal cortex and its development influence executive functioning or cognition more broadly? It's thought that the waves of brain development that do exist even late in our developmental trajectory support more and more efficient, consistent, and sophisticated cognitive processing. So in other words, the amount of energy our brain needs to spend in order to do difficult cognitive tasks, that goes down with age, so the brain becomes more efficient at doing its job. The consistency, so being able to complete challenging cognitive tasks repeatedly in different circumstances and so on, we become more consistent as we grow. And this has been linked to development in the prefrontal cortex. And the ability to sort of manage multiple streams of information and make complex judgments is something that the prefrontal cortex also supports and has been correlated with markers of brain development in that area.
That's helpful. And are there any, let me just get some of the questions from the audience. Can you talk about the impact of trauma on brain development and how that could affect sort of normative brain development?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty major topic about how environmental experiences that may have been experienced at different points of our development may shape and sort of bend the trajectory for an individual person. We know that trauma, this is not my area of primary expertise, but generally speaking, we know that trauma increases the risk of a number of forms of negative health outcomes, including mental health. You can also see that reflected in the developing brain. What exactly the patterns are is fairly complex. There's some research suggesting that trauma can accelerate brain development, which might on its face sound like a good thing, but it may actually not be that good of a thing because the plasticity or the ability for the brain to react in an adaptive way to its environment may be less flexible if in the case of accelerated development. There is also some research suggesting that certain kinds of information processing might be sensitized, like threat processing, or that our ability to manage stress through the bodily and brain systems that are reactive to stress may become blunted and less able to flexibly manage stress under these kinds of high high trauma or high conflict conditions. And there's a
Okay.
lot more out there, but probably
Yeah.
beyond the scope of our time.
Thank you. That's great. So just in 1 or 2 sentences, I have a question. That's a question for both of us. For you, how hopeful are you that the current research will be reflected in legal changes?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think that there's the conversations seem to be something people have an appetite for, which is exciting for a scientist to be invited to be involved in these discussions, even though they're very challenging. And I think that scientists are getting better at translating our work into those spaces, which is obviously quite important work for us to do as well. And I see that happening more and more, which leads me to be optimistic.
And I would say that, you know, I'm at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, so I definitely have hope. It might take a few years, but I think we're moving, you know, in a positive direction, at least in some jurisdictions. So thank you, Leah, so much for today. And thank you all for the wonderful questions. And I hope everyone has a good afternoon and will join us for our next event.